Okay, so we're going to get started. We respect everybody's time. Uh, Thank you all for joining IEC for our Lunch and Learn series. We hope these sessions will help keep our community connected during this difficult time, and we will make them publicly available as well. And just a special note to anybody that has been either directly or indirectly affected by the COVID crisis, the IEC team and our staff are keeping you in our thoughts, and we hope the situation ends as quickly as possible. But yes, keeping you in our thoughts and very concerned about the community. Since our founding in 1975 by a group of dedicated grassroots environmentalists, IEC has led issue advocacy campaigns by allowing environmental organizations to pool their resources and create a higher profile for environmental issues. Today, IEC represents more than 90 environmental and community organizations and nearly 300 individual members throughout Illinois. If you are not already a member of IEC and you are able to give, especially in this very difficult time, please consider joining today by using the link in the chat box. My name is Gavin Taves. I am the Energy Policy Director for IEC, and Jen Walling, our Executive Director, will be joining us and managing the chat box and taking questions as they come up. So a few housekeeping items. As Jen said, all attendees are muted by default. And if you joined via Zoom, you can use the chat function to ask questions, add comments, or provide resources as you think of them. Time permitting, we will take live questions at the end of the session. If Jen, please correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're on the phone, is it *9 to unmute yourself? Is that right?
*6 to unmute yourself, *9 to mute. Wait, did I just get that wrong? Sorry. Let me have it open on our participant guide. *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute.
Got it. *9 to raise your hand, *6 to unmute. Okay. And yeah, so with that, I'd like to introduce Brian Granahan. I hope I got the pronunciation correct there, from the Illinois Power Agency, who will be speaking about clean energy procurement. So just as a note, we will take questions and collect them during the presentation and then moderate afterwards. So Brian, go ahead and kick it off.
Sure. Thank you, Gavin. Thank you, Jen. I apologize. I don't have a nice background together. I'm literally doing this from my couch right now. So I've got artwork here, and that's about it. Maybe for the next one, I'll have some sort of painting behind me or something a little bit better. As Gavin indicated, my name is Brian Granahan. I'm the Chief Legal Counsel at the Illinois Power Agency. I've been in that role since April of 2014, I believe. Prior to that, I worked at the Illinois Commerce Commission, among a few other different positions. So I have some history with the Illinois RPS dating back to probably 2007 or 2008 or so. Also a former board member of the Illinois Environmental Council, and it's very exciting to see the IEC doing this type of work. It's great when the IEC is a convening agent for so many different interests within the broader environmental movement. And hopefully I can help provide some illumination on clean energy issues as part of this series today. So give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about today through this slide. So who am I? Again, Chief Legal Counsel at the Illinois Power Agency. Talk about what the IPA does and why. Then talk about definitions of things. Talking about energy, we're talking about renewable energy, and we're talking about renewable energy in Illinois. What do those things mean? How are they defined in state law? How do we measure this? How do we determine compliance? Where are we right now? What is the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard? We hear a lot about 25% by 2025. We hear a lot of references to RPSs, whether in Illinois or in other states. Try to give an overview of what that is, how it works, and what sorts of targets and goals are found in the Illinois RPS. And then a snapshot of where renewables are today and then also going forward. What do we have under contract today such that we can look at it and say these are projects that are developed or will be developed? And what do we see as some of the opportunities and challenges in the coming years, which is something that I know the IEC is very focused on in thinking through different legislative alternatives. So going now into the IPA itself, the Illinois Power Agency was established in 2007 as kind of a sister agency to the Illinois Commerce Commission, which is the state's Public Utilities Commission. The goal of the IPA is to develop procurement plans and conduct procurement events to meet the supply requirements of Illinois' electric utilities. And that means they're default supply customers. So those customers who haven't switched to competitive service or switched to hourly pricing, as I'll get into in a little bit. That was why the agency was initially established. We were moved under the oversight of the Executive Ethics Commission in 2011. So we're actually not under the governor's office. Our director is appointed every 2 years by the state's EEC. In 2007, as part of the establishment of the agency, that same legislation also gave rise to the state's Renewable Portfolio Standard and the state's Energy Efficiency Portfolio Standard, and gave the IPA implementation responsibilities for the state's Renewable Portfolio Standard. And that was kind of bolted on at the time. And then as time has gone on and years have passed and renewable energy has become a much larger focus of state policy, it's become really one of the key parts of our work. It's probably what takes up most of our time, is implementing the state's RPS and conducting competitive procurements and running programs to do so. We have additional set of other responsibilities too. If you've heard anything about the zero emission standard, which is used to support at-risk nuclear plants, we're tasked with implementing that. We provide assistance on municipal aggregation initiatives. To the extent there were any clean coal facilities that could produce electricity in Illinois, we help develop those sourcing agreements. We have a resource development bureau for potentially starting a power plant. Back when we were established in 2007, there was thought there might be a need for that down the road. Not anything we're doing right now. So that's a bit of an overview of what the IPA is, and it's a bit of a unique space to be in. There aren't a lot of states that have something quite like the IPA. Some of those responsibilities might fall on electric utilities. Sometimes they might fall on state's energy office. Sometimes they might fall to the state's Public Utilities Commission. But Illinois is unique in the sense that it has this one agency that's tasked with implementation. Thinking about energy in Illinois, perhaps the best way to think about it is that there's 3 different legs to a stool as to where you could get your supply from. And this actually helps inform the evolution of the state's Renewable Portfolio Standard, as I'll get to on future slides. The IPA conducts procurement events to meet the supply requirements of the default supply customers of the state's electric utilities. That's about a half of a half, because it's basically residential and small commercial customers. So you start with that class, and then you start with those individuals or businesses within that class who haven't yet switched over to another form of supply. And we develop procurement plans and conduct procurement events in order to do so. And initially, the state's RPS had a specific mechanism for supporting renewable development that had a certain funding mechanism and planning mechanism just for those customers. Then you have hourly pricing customers. I happen to be an hourly pricing customer. Our agency's director is an hourly pricing customer, where your price varies on real-time market conditions on an hourly basis. It's a good plan to be on if you, for instance, have a certain load profile that means that you're using a lot of electricity when it's less expensive. And then the vast majority of the market in Illinois is served by competitive suppliers, alternative retail electric suppliers. They serve primarily, they serve most commercial and industrial customers, although some are on hourly pricing, and then obviously a lot of the residential and small commercial market as well. And then you have municipal utilities and rural electric cooperatives who kind of sit outside of anything that we do or anything that the ICC does. And that's where energy is really coming in and being brought to customers in Illinois through one of these 3 different sorts of pathways where a customer is taking service from a given entity that's providing them with supply. Renewable energy in Illinois is defined in the Illinois Power Agency Act in Section 1-10 of the Act. And it basically is defined by the generating technology that is used to produce that electricity. And the Illinois definition is perhaps different than it is in certain other states. For instance, we have this distinction on landfill gas, where if it's produced in Illinois, it's considered renewable, but not if it is elsewhere. Restrictions on hydropower that doesn't involve the construction of new dams. You'll see variance on what constitutes renewable energy from state to state. Here, we're primarily focused on wind and solar when it comes to our state's RPS, because that's just the way that our laws are written, and that's where we have targets that say, have this many RECs under contract from these particular generating technologies. Again, all of this will become a little bit more clear in future slides. Most renewable energy compliance in Illinois is done through renewable energy credits. And this can be a very complicated topic for someone who's not well steeped in this space, because a REC constitutes effectively the environmental attributes of electricity generated decoupled from that electricity itself. Think of it as sort of a proxy market, or a way to just parse out the intangible positive environmental attributes from electricity generation from the actual electricity itself. And then those RECs are traded separately and sold separately. And in Illinois, they're purchased by Illinois electric utilities to meet compliance obligations that constitutes our state's RPS. If you were to take a REC and you produce electricity from one of those qualifying technologies on the list in this slide, and you produce a megawatt hour of that electricity, you can have a REC once your facility is registered in a tracking system and it can be certified so that you can produce that REC, and you have the electricity itself. Those two things can be subject to separate transactions. And that can be a bit of a complicated thing, but once the REC is sold, then the underlying energy, you can't make environmental claims on it because all of those environmental claims are wrapped up in the renewable energy credit itself. And that renewable energy credit is what the state of Illinois uses to determine its compliance with the state's renewable portfolio standard. How many renewable energy credits are being purchased versus the overall amount of electricity that we're consuming outside of the munis and co-ops in the state. So, in a given year, for instance, we might have 120 million megawatt hours of electricity that constitutes retail sales in Illinois. To get to 25% of that, then you would need 30 million megawatt hours of renewable energy credits or 30 million RECs. And that's essentially a way to think about our RPS is us making sure that we're capturing enough environmental attributes through the purchase of RECs. Now, REC pricing varies. This is a way to provide revenue back to the generator of a renewable energy product because their environmental attributes may not be recognized in other markets. And for reasons that I'll get into, in some cases, they're set through competitive bidding. In other cases, they may be administratively set. Basically depends on the objective and what that particular program or procurement is trying to accomplish. But in most cases, when people are looking at revenue from renewable energy credits, they're thinking to themselves, okay, we can facilitate the development of a new renewable energy project. Maybe how much revenue is required to allow that project to pencil out? How can we actually ensure that this new facility is brought online? And that informs a lot of how RECs are priced. So taking a step back and thinking about Illinois, we have this renewable portfolio standard and where it started from and where it is today. Back at the start of the RPS, there were basically three different ways through which you can apply, going back to our prior slides on your supply source. You had a set of obligations for the eligible retail customers of electric utilities, which is default supply customers. And those default supply customers had a small surcharge on their electric bill. And that money was pooled together and would fund REC procurements. And the IPA would conduct those procurements. And effectively, that was all self-contained. For hourly pricing customers, they were making alternative compliance payments, which basically sat in a slightly separate bucket. And then for alternative suppliers, they had a different compliance pathway altogether. For up to 50% of their obligation, they could just go to the market and buy RECs associated with the electricity that they sold, and then they made alternative compliance payments for the remainder of that obligation. Those funds then went to the state up until 2017 as part of the Renewable Energy Resources Fund, which is now used to help support the Illinois Solar for All program, which I'll get into in later slides. But because you have a lot of customers switching between these supply sources, and because you don't necessarily have stability, this made long-term contracting a real challenge. Back in 2010, the IPA conducted a series of procurements to try to get a number of new wind farms developed. And those contracts, after a few years' time, when a number of customers started switching from being supply customers of the utilities over to taking supply from alternative suppliers, primarily through a phenomenon known as municipal aggregation, there wasn't the money available to actually pay down the full ledger of those contracts because enough customers had switched where customers have a rate impact cap, they can only be charged so much, and there just wasn't enough collections to meet the overall contractual obligations. So this whole system had to be fixed and revised in order to provide a more stable funding source to help facilitate the development of additional renewable energy in Illinois. And that came through a bill that passed in December of 2016 and took effect on June 1st, 2017. That's Public Act 99-0906, colloquially known as the Future Energy Jobs Act, or FEJA. And one of the primary things that FEJA sought to do was to say, okay, if we're going to support additional renewable energy development in Illinois or recognize the environmental benefits of renewable energy, let's not have these different funding mechanisms. Let's try to consolidate this and put this into one mechanism so that we have one stable pot of funding that we can then engage in longer term planning out of. So FEJA basically took those prior separate compliance obligations, phased them out, and then created a surcharge that applied no matter whether you were taking supply from an alternative supplier or from the utility itself or through hourly pricing, and then established basically a stable year-over-year budget that we could plan out of as a consequence. Now, the targets that we have for Illinois, the 25% by 25 that informs the Illinois RPS, also now cover all of that retail customer load, whether it's served by utility for supply or whether it's served by alternative suppliers. And the assessment of surcharge is basically to any delivery service customers. Now, we have money that's been pulled together. The question becomes, how do we decide what to do with it to bring renewables under contract in order to develop more renewable energy in Illinois? And there was a long-term procurement planning process also called for as a part of that. Through that, in slides that I'll get into later, the IPA basically pulls together a plan, submits that to the State's Public Utilities Commission for approval. Other parties chime in with their comments, and it ends up being litigated there. One of the other things that we're doing now too is instead of just conducting big competitive procurements regarding big projects, we're also running programs at the IPA to focus on specific, more targeted interests, whether it's low-income specific solar programs or whether it's rooftop solar. But this is only for RECs. So if you have, say, a 100 megawatt wind farm, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily selling their electricity to the IPA. They have that separately. This is just, the RECs are the only piece that's basically providing them with that revenue certainty off of the work that we do. This is just another slide that gets into some of the changes that were made in the RPS, pooling the funds together, using that single charge. And one thing to keep in mind is that the RECs are actually being purchased by the utilities. When you have, if you were to look at your electric bill today, you might see a small surcharge there for renewable energy. That money is being held by the utilities, and then they're the ones who are purchasing and retiring the RECs to meet compliance obligations. They're the actual counterparty to contracts that the IPA develops and through programs it administers. But the utilities are the purchaser of the RECs, and then they retire the RECs in order to meet a compliance requirement. The compliance is based on a percentage of retail sales, and there's a real focus in the new RPS on new wind and new solar. So that's been a big focus of our attention, is how can we get new wind and especially new solar developed in Illinois through these tools that we have through revisions to the state's RPS. When we talk about pooling funds together, I think it's helpful to get an understanding of just how much this is. And the highlighted column, the second column over beyond the delivery year column, gives you a sense of what these annual collections look like. This is taken from our most recent long-term renewable resources procurement plan, and we're collecting about $225 to $220 million a year to help support the development of new renewable energy in Illinois. So that's those surcharges on your bill, all of us put together, pooled together, and then basically distributed through REC delivery contracts where we're paying for renewable energy credits out of that money that's pooled together. And that should give you at least a little bit of a sense of scale when it comes to state administered support for new renewable energy development. Now, the targets that we have in the new RPS are not just that 25% by 2025, where if you were to take all the electricity sales in Illinois by the year 2025, we want to hit 25% of that with renewables as demonstrated through the purchase of a REC. We also have some targets that are very specific to ensuring that we have new build of wind and solar. And this is something that was never part of the state's RPS for the prior 10 years, but was folded in with the act in 2007. So 2 million RECs being under contract from new solar facilities and 2 million RECs from new wind facilities by 2020 was one of the targets that we have in the statute. And that ascends to 3 million by 2025 and 4 million by 2030. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, about 1 million RECs from new solar, given the capacity factor of a solar facility, means about a 650 to 700 megawatt amount of new solar development. What does that actually mean? Well, a given household might have, say, enough electricity consumption where it could be completely offset by about a 5 kilowatt system. So 1 megawatts might serve 200 households or so. So 100 megawatts, you might be looking at then 100 more times of that. So it's basically that many households that you then just sort of scale up and say, this is how much through 700 megawatts of new solar we would then be ultimately able to support. And we've seen great progress on these targets, and we're on pace to surpass those targets and have 1,500 to 2,000 megawatts of new solar in the state through utility scale projects, plus an additional amount through rooftop solar and what's known as community solar, which is more of a subscription-based service. So one of the other things the new RPS brought into focus was this idea of focusing on the specific type of project. So at least 40% of those new build targets must come from utility scale projects, which under Illinois law just means facilities that are larger than 2 megawatts, and 50% from community solar or distributed generation. Distributed generation refers to a project that sits behind the customer's meter. So it's best understood as rooftop solar, although you might have something else on site. You might be taking advantage of, a backyard or some sort of field, or on a farm, you might be using some land that you have to site your solar project. Community solar is more of a centralized project that you take a subscription to. So it's interconnected slightly differently. It's not directly offsetting a customer's use, but a customer can achieve a bill credit from that project, effectively signing up to that project and then being able to receive a bill credit from it. The main thing to keep in mind here is that we're supporting these sorts of projects that are more diffuse at a much greater level than we were before. The community solar projects that take subscribers and the distributed generation projects that sit behind the customer's meter are getting much more support from the current Illinois RPS than they did under the prior Illinois RPS. There are also vocational requirements in the new RPS where we're thinking about this in terms of renewable energy credits. There's the question of where is that facility that's producing the renewable energy credit? Prior to changes in the RPS, we would look to Illinois and adjacent states. Now we pretty much just look to Illinois and then have some qualitative language in the law that says when we can purchase RECs from adjacent states and count them toward the Illinois RPS. This is something that's interpreted in our long-term renewable resources procurement plan, where we basically take 5 qualitative criteria and reduce them down into a quantitative scoring requirement. And right now you could have a map that has concentric circles into each adjacent state, determining where that project needs to be for its RECs to be able to count for the Illinois RPS. The big picture takeaway is that the vast majority of projects being supported under the RPS are located in Illinois. So 25% by 2025, just trying to put this into perspective, what does any of this mean? Well, a few columns over, you can see the reference to your load. This is basically how many retail or how many megawatt hours are subject to retail sales of electricity in Illinois, and it's about 120 million. So as we creep toward the 25% by 2025, we see that we need 21 million RECs, 22 million RECs, 23 million RECs, 24 million RECs, up to about 30 million RECs by the 2025 delivery year. And that's a significant number of RECs to have under contract. That's, if we're looking at a million RECs being about 650 to 700 megawatts of new solar, then 10 million RECs, you're talking about 7,000 megawatts of new solar. That starts to get into the range of the amount of nuclear facilities that we have, or the amount of nuclear capacity we have in Illinois, which I believe is about 11,000 megawatts or so. So you start to see this trajectory would require a very significant growth in the amount of renewable energy that we have in Illinois in order to meet it, especially for meeting it through new projects. So some of the key features of the Illinois RPS, how do we actually do this? How do we say we're going to get this many RECs under contract through facilitating the development of this massive amount of new projects? Well, for big utility scale projects, we have competitive procurements. So this might be a 50 megawatt solar project. It may be a 500 megawatt wind project. And the IPA develops a standard contract for the delivery of RECs from that project, and then essentially conducts a competitive procurement where bidders come in and they bid their price for what they believe they can develop the facility at. So the bidder demonstrates some level of site maturity, having site control, being willing to post collateral, says, I believe I can develop a project at that price. Then they bid that price, and the lowest price ultimately wins out. And that's how we ensure that in a universe of scarce resources, we're developing the most efficient projects possible. So this is the process that we use for projects that are larger than 2 megawatts. And it tends to be projects that are much larger than that, just because lower prices tend to come from facilities that can take advantage of economies of scale. Now, there's certain benefits associated with developing large-scale renewable projects. Among them are, it's a much better model, for instance, for wind generation, where distributed wind that sits behind your meter doesn't really work in the same way as solar would. You're able to take advantage of economies of scale and develop projects with a much lower cost structure on average. On the other hand, there's benefits to developing small projects too. They're more diffuse. It may make the grid more resilient in the long run. It serves to, in some ways, democratize energy production by virtue of having small projects that might be behind the customer's meter. So there's a balance and there's a trade-off, and the Illinois RPS addresses that through having targets for utility scale projects and targets for smaller projects as well. For those smaller projects, which is really anything below 2 megawatts in size, we have what's called the Adjustable Block Program, or Illinois Shines, as we're branding it publicly. And that's a program where we basically set administratively what we think the REC prices ought to be. What is the incentive that we're providing to project developers who are developing new small-scale solar projects? And then they can come in, take advantage of that REC contract, and use that revenue certainty to help offset potentially the customer's cost associated with having that project on their rooftop, or the customer subscription cost if it's a community solar project and the customer is subscribing to that. And so those prices step down over time. That's the nature, it's the block element to it as more program participation occurs. And right now we've had great success developing, especially community solar and large distributed generation projects with the Adjustable Block Program. Very good success with smaller projects, those that are primarily just residential rooftop projects, but we still have a lot more program capacity for smaller projects. And then lastly, we have a low-income focused program, the Illinois Solar for All program. And we have a budget of that for about $30 million per year. 20 million or so is made up of funds that are actually held by the state. And those are those, back when we had the 3 compliance mechanisms for the RPS, you had alternative retail electric suppliers making payments, and those funds went into the Renewable Energy Resources Fund. And now we can use those to fund a targeted low-income solar program. And we have 4 different sub-programs, 2 of which are community solar based, to help low-income customers, nonprofits, and public facilities take advantage of renewable energy. So our proposals for how we do all of this are wrapped up in what's called our long-term renewable resource procurement plan. So as we drill down deeper and deeper from the big picture targets and the budget numbers into the specific programs, into what do those contracts look like? How does someone participate? How mature does that project have to be? What sort of proof do they have to offer? How do they interact with the programs? What sort of deadlines apply? All of those are wrapped up in this plan that we developed initially in 2017, filed with the Illinois Commerce Commission for approval that year, and was approved by the ICC in 2018, and then we update every 2 years. If you go to the Illinois Commerce Commission's website, you can look up these docket numbers that are listed and start to get a feel for what sorts of issues become contested issues in a proceeding like this. So if you look at the framework and you drill down to some of the details, what exactly are the points of disagreement? I think it's actually a really illuminating look at how renewable energy development, just like anything else that we deal with, is more complicated the deeper down you dig into it. This is just a sense of what our plan looks like and where you can find it. What we always do before these processes is have a series of workshops, publish that document. It's about 200 pages long, contains different chapters. You'll see in the next slide, or a couple slides over, for all the different portions of the plan. If you're a lawyer who's here potentially for CLE credit, I would suggest looking at chapter 2 of that plan, because it gives you a framework of the Illinois RPS, the evolution of the RPS, and all the different legal issues that had to be answered in the development of that plan. To get a sense of the budgets, chapter 3 is very useful to give you a sense of some of the funding crunches that we face right now. Locational requirements are in chapter 4. How do we take qualitative language around when an adjacent state facility's RECs can qualify for the Illinois RPS, and then turn that into an actual quantitative scoring standard. And then a lot of the different program or procurement specific items are located in chapters 5 through 8. And this is just a little bit of a schedule from the statute regarding what that plan needs to contain. It's essentially, what are our proposals for how we're going to meet these requirements, for how we're going to meet this 25% by 2025? How are we going to meet those 2 million, 3 million, 4 million new build targets for RECs delivered from new wind and new solar facilities? And then any of those REC contracts ultimately have to be put to the Illinois Commerce Commission for its review and approval before they can move forward. So just something to keep in mind. This is just an overview of the Adjustable Block Program, which again is a program that we have for distributed generation projects, projects that sit behind a customer's electric meter, and community solar projects, these centralized projects that customers take subscription to and then receive an offset on their bill. This should give you some sense at a high level of how the program operates. The big thing to know is that what the developer of a project like this is receiving through participation in the program is essentially a payment for 15 years of the RECs, those environmental attributes associated with electricity generation generated by the project. So we've decoupled those from the actual energy itself, and then we're selling those through the state administered program to provide an incentive back to the project developer that can then offset the cost of the system to the customer or the cost of the subscription, or allow the system to be financed and ultimately be developed. And then over time, as those blocks fill up with new systems, we open up a new block at a slightly lower price until all blocks are filled, which is a function of just exactly how much budget we have available. And as it stands right now, this will just give you a bit of an overview of where we are with all of the development that we've undertaken under these programs to date. So prior to Public Act 99-0906, which introduced all the different revisions to the Illinois RPS, we had a significant amount of wind in Illinois, about 4,500 megawatts of wind, but only about 80 megawatts of solar, which is very low. If you look at states like Massachusetts and New Jersey, you know, California might not be the best example. They have an enormous amount of solar development, but I think they're a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of the quality of their solar resource, for instance. Whereas Illinois is maybe more comparable to states like Massachusetts and New Jersey. They were putting on hundreds of megawatts of new solar per year. Illinois, despite having an RPS since 2007, as of 2007-2018, only had about 80 megawatts of solar. So our RPS wasn't doing a good job of facilitating new solar development. Under Public Act 99-0906, through the Adjustable Block Program, through the Illinois Solar for All Program, through the competitive procurements that we've conducted for those large-scale wind and solar projects, we're now looking at about an additional 2,500 megawatts of solar. If you were to take like a 2-reactor nuclear facility, that's about 2,000 megawatts. Now, the actual electrical output of those facilities isn't quite the same. The amount of electricity it produces isn't the same because of the intermittency of solar. It's not producing electricity during the night or when the sun isn't out the same way, and has a lower, what's called capacity factor as a result. But nevertheless, in terms of overall installed capacity, this is on the scale of major large-scale power plants that we've been able to facilitate the development of through the bill that passed back in 2016 and came into law in 2017. Now, the majority of what we've facilitated the development of has been large utility scale projects. Prices for those are much, much, much lower than the administratively set prices for the smaller systems. And that just makes sense because you don't have customer acquisition costs with those projects. You have economies of scale. A lot of the siting issues are less complicated than if you have a number of different diffuse projects. So we've been able to do a lot more when it comes to helping the development of new utility scale projects. Nevertheless, we're looking at about 700 megawatts of distributed generation and community solar, and it's about 500 of that's distributed generation. So about 500 megawatts of projects now, rooftop solar or on-site solar projects that are sitting behind a customer's meter in Illinois will be online in the next year or two. And that's a huge step up from what we've had in the past. And it's one of the greatest growth rates that we've seen over the last few years of any state in the country. So Illinois is really on the cutting edge when it comes to being a new solar market that's opened up, that's developed a significant number of projects. And a significant portion of that as well are very small projects, over 100 megawatts worth of very small projects that are intended to offset the use of residential customers. So homeowners in Illinois right now are taking advantage of these programs, putting solar on the rooftops. And that's a state of affairs that we didn't have in Illinois over the past 10 years that we do have now. We've also facilitated the development of about 1,000 megawatts of additional wind in Illinois. But this is exclusively utility scale. We did conduct some procurements seeking potentially other forms of wind or other non-solar generation and didn't get a lot of interest or a lot of response. So these are just big utility scale projects that will be online in the next few years where their RECs are being sold through our programs. Now, thinking through how this matches up to the targets that we have in the law. So we have those new build targets that show up as a number of RECs. 2 million RECs by 2020 delivered annually, 3 million RECs by 2025, 4 million by 2030. We're actually on pace to well exceed those. We're going to pass the 2020 marks. We're going to have met the 2025 marks. So we've facilitated more new wind and solar in Illinois than the law called for upon its passage back in 2017. So that's been a great success overall. Having said that, even with all of that new development, we're still well short of the percentage-based RPS requirements, that 25% by 2025. I'll just give you some sense of scale on this by going back to a prior slide. On the right-hand column, you'll see just how many RECs would be required to hit that 25% by 2025. You're talking about 20 million to 30 million RECs as you go across time. To get the thousands of megawatts of new generation online, we're selling maybe 7 or 8 million RECs total. So we're still dealing with a very big gap in the number of RECs that are required to meet the 25% by 2025, even though we've met the specific targets in the law for new build. So I think the best way to look at this is at a bit of a mixed success. We've been very successful in transforming the Illinois market and bringing a lot of new wind and new solar online, but there hasn't really been this bridging of the gap to get to the broader vision of 25% by 2025. And this could give you some sense of the amount of RECs that we see likely to be under contract through all the competitive procurements and programs that we run to date. It ends up being about 10 million RECs per year. So we're getting to 8 or 9%, but we're not getting to that number of 25% by 2025 in quite the same way. And all of these are exclusively from wind and solar. Given the way things are prioritized in the law, we have to meet targets for new wind and new solar development. And as a consequence, you have 100% of these RECs coming from new wind and new solar. This is a slide that highlights the actual REC gap. So you see that on the left-hand side, you see how many RECs we would need to meet those targets in the law, and you see our statewide portfolio. The reason why it declines over time is because of some legacy contracts from some small-scale procurements that we did, I believe. So we did a few things that were much smaller in scale to help facilitate some new projects, and those will eventually go offline because the contract length of those REC contracts is only about 5 years. And then you see the gap growing over time because unless we're conducting additional procurements or opening up additional blocks in our program, we have the same number of RECs coming in annually from all those projects that have been developed, but the target keeps on going up, so we end up with a greater gap as is shown on the right-hand side of the screen. This is a visual representation of some of this phenomenon. You see the climb through that yellow line represented through the targets, and the gray area is that gap. The blue is what we were able to accomplish through our competitive procurements. So that's exclusively utility scale projects, exclusively wind and solar. The orange-ish band is through the adjustable block program. So that's community solar and distributed generation. And that's what it accounts for if we don't open any additional blocks. So this is where we are relative to those 25% targets. Again, you know, I think it's a great success, but we have to put some of this into context when we're thinking about completely transforming where electricity is generated from in Illinois. I want to talk a little bit about upcoming opportunities. What comes next now that we've opened these programs and conducted these procurements and we have what we've described under contract? We have an additional utility scale wind procurement event coming up that's scheduled, and that will have a 1,000 REC target associated with it. When you back that out and say, what does that mean in terms of actual installed capacity from 1,000 RECs of wind? Unlike solar, where it's about 650 to 700 megawatts, with wind, it's more like 350 megawatts. So assuming everything is successful with that procurement event, we'll have another 350 megawatts or so of wind. With respect to our adjustable block program, even given the current funding crunch, we have an additional about 75 megawatts of capacity or so available for small projects. These are under 10 kilowatt projects. So primarily residential rooftop or on-site projects. So if you're a homeowner and you want to take advantage of solar, there's still support through a state-administered program to provide you with a generous incentive for going solar yourself. As you've probably heard about in the news or elsewhere, we have a massive wait list of community solar projects in Illinois. Through the initial opening of the adjustable block program, we were able to support about over 100 of those projects, but there's another 800 or so beyond that that have actually applied to be in the program. Part of that may have extended from the incentive structure that we set up for projects that did apply. So they were effectively part of a random lottery process, so in terms of who was selected to actually receive a REC contract. But nevertheless, it demonstrates that because each of these projects had to have site control, someone had to be willing to host that project, there's still a huge capacity for additional solar development in Illinois that's demonstrated by being able to get that acquiescence to people being willing to sell land or otherwise host a solar project. We've also had a great market response for large distributed generation projects in Illinois. I think when we opened the program, this is one of the things that we were really surprised by, was just how many projects were ready to go that were serving commercial industrial customers. So this might be the rooftop of an IKEA, it might be a manufacturing facility, it might be a small business. But these are projects that range from 10 kilowatts in size, which is about slightly larger than the size, I believe, of the IEC offices solar facility, all the way up to 2 megawatts in size, where you might be dealing with a large manufacturing or logistics facility being able to host a project of that size and offset all of its use. And we've had a huge market response for those sorts of projects, to the point where now we basically run out of capacity to support additional projects. I want to talk a little bit about challenges too, because these are things that the IEC is often talking about, and they certainly inform our day-to-day work at the IPA. One of the biggest challenges we have is budget constraints. We collect about $220 to $230 million a year, not the IPA specifically, but utilities do, through surcharges to customers' bills, and then all of that is being committed to these REC delivery contracts. The REC delivery contracts involve prepayment for 15 years worth of RECs. The smallest system, all of that's made up front. And then with larger systems like community solar and large distributed generation, it occurs over 4 years' time. This creates a bit of a spike in payments that are required once those systems actually start receiving payment. It's actually something that comes up now in the context of COVID-19, where we could be looking at projects that are currently being constructed that may take additional time to construct. Now, you might look at this and say, well, that's fine. You're collecting this money year after year. You can just use the money that you collected in prior years, and you're not spending it now because these systems aren't actually energized yet, and you'll spend it in later years when those systems do become energized. But due to a quirk in the law, collections that were made during the first 4 years, which is through the middle of 2021, actually can't be used for future years' contract obligations beginning June 1st, 2021. So that creates a bit of an issue, as I'll show on the next slide. It's the funding collection rollover issue, where we can't carry funds over collected in prior years, absence of change in the law, and use them for future years' obligations unless the law is edited such that we can. And as system development timelines just continue to get delayed, and it's not just COVID-19, but it's just the phenomenon that everything takes twice as long and costs twice as much when you're dealing with project development, that does create a bit of a tight issue. So just to give you a visual representation of this, these are slides that we put together, I believe, last fall, potentially. So the situation may even be worse now as we're dealing with systems needing extensions due to COVID-19 and related concerns. We have this big spike in the 2020-2021 delivery year, as a lot of those systems that we'd had participating in our programs now come online and are receiving payments. And then we have this collected fund of payments that we can't then carry forward and meet future years' obligations. We do have some of the compliance payments that were made under the prior mechanisms of the RPS that we can draw upon to bridge those gaps, but we don't have enough funding coming in through those utility surcharges if this money that was previously collected is being forfeited to be able to meet all those obligations. So we're essentially having to draw down what's like a rainy day fund much more quickly than we'd like to otherwise. A few other issues that we've seen come up. One is siting challenges. You know, as time goes on, you might see more concerns from local landowners or homeowners. You know, kind of pick the low-hanging fruit when it comes to good sites, whether it's because of the quality of the resource or the willingness of the landowner. I think just with anything else, as a market grows and a market matures, you start to having to go a little bit deeper and a little bit further to find the best places to put projects. Something to keep in mind going forward. Regional transmission organization interconnection delays are another issue, especially in MISO, which is, you know, covers the bottom two-thirds of the state for Illinois. We're seeing utility scale projects there taking longer to move their way through the regional transmission organization interconnection queue. And actually, there was a bill that passed, I believe it was last year, to extend the first delivery deadlines for certain projects by an additional year because they felt like it was going to take them much longer to get interconnected than they thought. What I think that serves to underscore is that there's a lot of moving pieces when it comes to renewable energy project development. And you can't always predict the timelines that apply to each of those pieces, and you might be depending on other actors to move forward. As a consequence, because you're trying to hold all of these things together, developing projects may involve more risk and take more time than you otherwise thought, and the system just needs to be built with perhaps more safeguards in place. Not to say that those projects won't be developed, it's just to say that it might take a little bit longer, and we have to then account for the fact that those systems might not be online for a couple more years. Given the funding crunch described in this slide, and given the need for even fixing the rollover issue, having additional funding to try to help meet that 25% by 2025 requirement, or a more aggressive requirement as states are talking about 100% clean energy, there's also a lot of talk about legislative solutions. You know, this is something, if you're here, you probably follow the Environmental Council.
Reduce student. Wasn't he like at first base one time?
Trying to figure out legislative solutions to ensure that there's more funding available to support renewable energy development. Something to keep your eye on. Obviously, the General Assembly is not meeting right now, so that makes things more difficult. But there are some inventive solutions being offered out there, and it's something that, you know, we don't want to offer normative analysis of the IPA on any solution, but just something to keep in mind that this is the sort of problem that they're trying to fix. So hopefully this was a useful overview of renewable energy development in Illinois, how we get our renewable energy, where it comes from, how it's funded, what sorts of projects are being developed, and what sort of trajectory we're on in terms of transforming the electricity sector in Illinois to one that is cleaner and more focused on renewables. And Gavin, with that, any questions you have?
Thanks so much, Brian. That was great and very, very detailed. We really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through that. There were several questions, so I am going to get through as many as we can. We have about 13 minutes left. Just as two notes, for the lawyers who've joined us, to get CLE credit, please go to the link in the chat box. You can see it posted 3 messages back. And if you follow that, fill out the document, you'll be able to get your credit for the event. And secondly, if we do not get to your questions today, please email me at gtaves@ilenviro.org. I put it in the chat box as well, and we'll do our best to get you answers. Okay, so on to some questions. Somebody asked, what is hourly pricing and how does that work in Illinois? Could you help us out with that?
To a certain extent, I can. I'm not probably the authority on this, our director is, but hourly pricing allows you to take advantage of actual real-time wholesale market conditions with the price that you pay for electricity. So the price of electricity varies across the day. You don't see this if you're on default supply, and you generally don't see this if you're taking service from a competitive supplier where you have a fixed price. So you might be paying 7 cents a kilowatt hour. Under hourly pricing, you might be paying 10 cents per kilowatt hour during the peak hours. Let's say it's 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. on a given day. But overnight, you might be paying 3 cents per kilowatt hour because electricity ultimately is not being used at the same scale during that time period. And so the wholesale market for that product, given the reduction in demand, is actually going to be quite a bit lower. If you can pair this, for instance, with smart appliances such as your thermostat or your dishwasher, or your washing machine, and then know to take advantage of those things in your house that use electricity at night, you can actually save a lot on hourly pricing because you're able to then better match your electricity consumption with the points in time in which prices are lowest. So it's definitely something to think about if you work a standard 9-to-5 job and you're not using a lot of electricity at your home during the day. But it does create issues if you're using a lot of electricity during the peak periods, because then your prices might be more expensive on average.
Sure, thank you. That was great. Another attendee asked about the relationship between the RPS and municipal utilities, and asking, they asked why RPS doesn't apply to municipal utilities. Could you expand on that?
Sure. All of this just stems from basically state regulation, and states through state law and through the Illinois Commerce Commission, the Illinois Power Agency, just regulate the state's regulated monopolies, the state's electric utilities. Municipal utilities and rural electric cooperatives are excluded from that form of regulation, and everything that we do through the RPS is effectively funneled through the state's Public Utilities Commission that the munis and the co-ops sit outside of. At a big picture level, I mean, the answer is because state law says that it doesn't, I guess is the best way to put it. Projects located in municipal utilities and rural electric cooperatives can qualify for the Illinois Adjustable Block Program, for the Solar for All program. So you still can receive the benefits associated with those programs, assuming there aren't other barriers like net metering that would make your system uneconomic. And those RECs will count toward the state standards, but the actual load of munis and co-ops is not what we take into account when we determine progress toward the state's RPS. And they're not bound by those same requirements when it comes to, say, 25% by 2025 of the electricity that they're ultimately selling.
Great. Somebody else asked about interconnection deposits and whether or not utility scale developers need to put down those deposits before submitting bids for procurement.
So we have basically requirements on our procurement administrator's website, IPA-Energy RFP, I think it is. It's linked somewhere in the Illinois Power Agency's website that gets into the specific project maturity requirements required for projects in utility scale procurements. I don't believe they have to have an interconnection deposit down. I believe their project maturity requirements are generally a matter of demonstrating site control, posting collateral, and then having other ways of vetting the actual individual entity that wants to participate in the procurement event, and then submitting all the necessary forms on time. But I would not take my word for it, because A, the requirements are developed for each individual procurement event, and you should read and review those and make sure you're familiar with them. And B, I'm kind of just doing this offhand, and there are documents which say specifically what is required for those procurement events. So I would definitely just refer to those.
Sure. And another person was asking about the general status of community solar in Illinois. I know you touched on this at various points, saying that there was great success in the actual funding of community solar development in the state, but maybe just your personal thoughts on community solar development and the future of it.
Sure. So right now we have about 110, I think it is, projects, community solar projects that are under development in Illinois. And they're all on roughly the same trajectory, because when we opened the adjustable block program, we had more project applications than we had slots available. Then we held what was known as a lottery process to try to figure out which projects, through a random selection process, were going to receive REC delivery contracts, and thus get this incentive that would then facilitate their development. As a consequence, they're all starting from basically the same point in time. There's maybe one or two exceptions to this in terms of their development. And those projects, from the time that they actually got a REC delivery contract, then have 18 months toward development under that contract. There's opportunities for extensions, but those contracts were handed out probably in April or May, I think it was May or June of 2019. So we're just less than 1 year from that point. And on a normal schedule, we would see those projects actually come online and be energized sometimes this summer or maybe this fall. This is one of the areas where COVID-19 can actually provide a major barrier, and it's something we should be cognizant of, is if you miss 3 months, 4 months in a construction cycle because you can't assemble workers together, or because the site hosts might not be comfortable with you being on their property, or whatever it might be that shows up, and you not being able to move forward with that development work, you might actually be missing a year, because you might be missing time from the summer and the fall where you can conduct that sort of work, and be pushed into the winter months where you won't be able to restart construction again until sometime March or April when the weather is better. I think at this point, we don't know whether that's the case, but we are starting to get the first wave of inquiries from community solar project developers saying, this might take more time to develop than I actually originally thought. And as a consequence, if these systems aren't becoming energized until sometime in 2021, that exacerbates some of the budget issues that I'd outlined in the later slides of my presentation, because now those budget impacts are being felt even later, and those prior collected funds are much harder to use, or impossible to use in some cases, depending on the energization date, to pay off some of the obligations from the system becomes energized going forward. Having said all of that, there are still community solar projects, and the vast majority of them, because it's a big step in their financing, that are seeking out subscribers. So you still see subscription offers out there. What does it mean to be a subscriber? It means you sign up and you have a contractual relationship with this project, And through that, you're paying them a subscription fee, but you're receiving a credit on your electric bill as though you had a solar system on your rooftop. You're getting a bill credit through net metering, essentially. And oftentimes, based on the offers that we've seen, you're paying less in that subscription cost than you'll be getting through the net metering credit. We see 10%, 20% savings. So if your supply rate is 7 cents per kilowatt hour, you might only be paying 6.3 cents or 5.5 cents or whatever it is as a subscription fee, but getting a 7-cent credit in your community solar project. Those offers are out there. Getting the actual bill crediting, though, depends on the system producing electricity. Just like if you had a system on your rooftop, it would depend on that system producing electricity and you being able to take advantage of net metering. So the longer those systems take to become energized, the later it will be when we'll see subscribers getting bill crediting on their bill from that system's electricity production.
Right. And as maybe a closing question, because it looks like we're running a little bit low on time here, how do you see the proposed Clean Energy Jobs Act interacting with some of the goals that you've laid out and the overall trajectory of clean energy procurement in Illinois?
Well, I think right now we have a number of legislative proposals. There's probably 7 or 8 that are floating around right there. And all of this will probably be subject to some negotiation down the road. The legislature is not convening right now. So we do have a problem on our hands with respect to a limited budget and the inability to access prior collected funds and use those toward contractual obligations that have already been entered into. And that's more of a short-term fix that the IPA is focused on. There's this longer-term structural question of even if we get past something like this, and even if we scale up the amount that we're collecting a little bit, we saw those rec gaps. I can probably go to those slides that exist between 25% by 2025 versus what we have under contract to date. Where I think the Clean Energy Jobs Act is focused is saying, how can we take a more structural approach to trying to fix this sort of a gap, recognizing that if we're just kind of incrementally scaling things up, whether it's our collections or whether we're expecting the cost curve to come down over time, it's not necessarily going to get us toward 100% clean energy. It may not even be enough to get us toward 25% clean energy by 2025 or some later date. So how can we take a step back and look at utilizing things like capacity revenues and other ways to restructure how we meet our electricity supply requirements in Illinois to prioritize renewables and put things on a different structural path. So I guess the best way that I'd describe it, you know, we're neutral on pretty much every bill that comes out. We don't want to give normative opinions on legislation. It's just not the role the IPA plays or is well suited to play. But it's asking structural questions that based on these rec gaps really do need to be asked.
Great, really appreciate that. Brian, again, thank you for taking the time to talk to all of us today. This was great, really informative. I know that I personally learned a lot. Once again, if you have any other questions, please forward them to me, gtaves@illenviro.org. A big thank you to Brian. And finally, again, for all those affected by the COVID crisis, we're thinking about you and we'll get through this together. So yeah, thoughts. And with that, we'll conclude the presentation and we hope everybody has a great day. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Kevin.